To the Kuan Yew School of Public Policy. I'm delighted to see so many of you here this afternoon, but I think you have made the right choice in giving up your lunch break to be here with us, because we are going to listen to a distinguished speaker, and we will also be hearing the views of two distinguished panelists on a fascinating subject. Fascinating in itself, not merely, of course, for Asia and the 6 economies that have been surveyed, but in particular for all of us who are here in Singapore because of our preoccupation, not merely the government, but every one of us, aging or otherwise. It is an issue that confronts all of us. So it's a wonderfully timely survey and study, and we are very delighted that Prudential Corporation has taken the initiative to launch this study and to have the Center for Strategic and International Studies, the senior fellow who is in charge of the Aging Initiative, Dr. Richard Jackson, to tell us the main findings of this study. I will just say another word about the time management. Dr. Jackson will speak for about 25 minutes, and I will thereafter invite the two panelists, Dr. Donald Kanak and Professor Mukul Asher, to join us for a brief discussion. Each will be speaking about 8 minutes, and thereafter we will throw the discussion open to the floor, and I very much hope that all of you will be actively participating in the last half hour of our event this afternoon. So, Dr. Jackson, please.
Thank you. It's a pleasure and an honor to be here today. As the world's societies age, policymakers and business leaders are trying to peer into the future to better understand and better prepare for the needs of tomorrow's growing elderly populations. And nowhere is that harder to do than in East Asia. It's not just that the region is due to age so dramatically, but also that rapid development is transforming retirement behavior and expectations. Educational attainment, labor force attachment, income and wealth are all undergoing dramatic shifts from cohort to cohort and generation to generation. The extended family, which has been the center of retirement security since time immemorial, is under increasing stress from the forces of modernization, urbanization, industrialization, and the increasing competition of more individualistic Western values with Asian family values. Yet even as the family comes under increasing stress, in many countries in the region, government and market substitutes for the family are not yet fully developed. So to better understand the needs of retirees, in partnership and with generous support from Prudential, which I'm happy to acknowledge, we conducted a survey in China, Hong Kong, Malaysia, Singapore, South Korea, and Taiwan. The survey was based on nationally representative samples in all countries except China, where it was limited to urban areas, though representative within urban areas. Many studies, many surveys that look at retirement behavior and expectations focus exclusively on higher earners, on the more educated, higher earning segment of the population. We tried to make our survey more inclusive and more representative to include people both in the formal and the informal sector, people at all levels of educational attainment. The survey universe, which is survey jargon for the people we talked to. The people we talked to were main earners in the household, both current main earners and retired main earners. Why main earners? Well, I think it's fairly obvious because these are the people who are most likely to be responsible for a family's retirement planning, and also the people who are most likely to have a detailed understanding of the household's finances. Respondents were asked both about their general attitudes toward retirement, toward retirement and more broadly family and savings, and also about their personal retirement behavior and expectations. Current retirees were asked about their current experience. Current workers were asked about their expectations for their own retirement in the future. One of the most startling findings, I think, in the survey was the extent to which support for the family's role in retirement provision has eroded. When we asked people who should be primarily responsible for retirement provision, we didn't expect majorities in any country to say the family. But we expected a larger number of people to say the family than was actually the case. In China, when asked who ideally should have primary responsibility for providing income to retired people, only 4% of respondents said grown children or other family members. Singapore, at 22%, is at the high end of the spectrum. And indeed, as you'll see, on any measure that has to do with sort of Confucian value expectations of family support, although the numbers may be lower than you would have anticipated, they are higher in Singapore than in any other country, which seems to me to be a relative advantage. What are the explanations for this finding? I think there are two. Part of it may have to do with the demographic shift itself. Today's elderly in all of the 6 countries we surveyed, the vast majority, more than 95%, have at least 2 children, and most have 3 or more children, to share the responsibility of filial piety. A very large share of today's young adults will have only 1 child, and many will have no children at all. So the shifting demographics may be part of this, but I think more broadly, it is the development process and the urbanization, industrialization, and value shift that follows in its wake. We asked people what children's responsibility toward their parents should be. And in every country, a large share of respondents, at least a third, and in Singapore, more than a half, did give the traditional expected answer. Parents should be honored and respected, and children should help support them in any way that they possibly can. But perhaps the more significant finding is that a sizable share of respondents begged to differ. In Singapore, 20% of respondents said that parents and children would be happier if they were more independent and self-sufficient. Again, Singapore is at the low end here. That share rises actually to a majority in South Korea and Taiwan. I wish we had conducted this survey 10, 15, or 20 years ago so that we had a baseline. I'm assuming that this represents a decline. But of course, I can't actually establish that. So if not the family, then who should be responsible? The survey finds in most countries a very significant level of support for individual savings-based responsibility for retirement income. In South Korea, a majority of respondents think that retirees themselves should be primarily responsible for providing their own retirement income through their own savings. And in Taiwan, Hong Kong, and Singapore, pluralities. As you'll note, China is the outlier there. Everybody in China thinks the government should be responsible, which may pose actually a big risk for China come the 2020s as China ages rapidly and expectations of government support collide with the realities of a rising old age dependency burden. Interestingly, and here we're looking just at Singapore, the support for individual savings-based retirement in Singapore is across the income spectrum. Sure, as you might anticipate, it's higher among people with the highest incomes. We're looking at multiples of the median income from 0.5 of the median all the way up to 5 times the median. And you can see that the support for individual savings-based retirement actually exceeds government support. And again, this is a normative question. It's what people think ideally should be the way things work, but at every income level. We also asked about people's expectations about, or how people ideally thought personal care for the frail elderly should be provided. And here, as you'd anticipate, a larger share of people thought that ideally the family should be the main provider. But what's astonishing to me is that not all people thought that. A surprisingly large share of people actually think that government should be. And in some of the same countries that have a very high level of support for individual responsibility for retirement income, you take South Korea. It had the highest level of support for individual responsibility for income, but it has the lowest level for individual responsibility for long-term care for the frail elderly. I think it's that people think of income and long-term care quite differently. Retirement is something we all hope to do someday. It's something we all aspire to, and it's therefore something we can plan and prepare for. Whereas long-term care is the need for long-term care is an unpredictable event, and the expense is lumpy. But in any case, you see here as well a weakening of the traditional assumption of family-centered support. Let me just give a sort of a quick overview of what the survey revealed, sort of a profile of today's retirement realities in Singapore. Much of this will not be news. Maybe some of it will be a little surprising. The relative income of the elderly, that is, the income of the elderly as a percent of the median for all households, is quite high in Singapore compared to most of the other survey countries. In societies that have recently experienced rapid development and rapid economic growth, you expect to see an economic marginalization of the elderly. Incomes, after all, are rising rapidly for the young. They're the ones who have the education and the skills and are more productive and are therefore enjoying the... and let me, for those of you who may be puzzled by these numbers, these are household income numbers. So this is the income of all members of the household in which the elderly person is living. Okay, these are household numbers. But in Singapore, we don't see that. We don't see this economic marginalization. And one of the reasons is the strength of family support. 63% of the elderly respondents in our survey live with their grown children, the highest rate of any of the countries. And income support flows clearly in the survey from young to old, up the age ladder, and strongly so still. But beyond that, it is high rates of pension receipt among the current elderly, benefits, income from the Central Provident Fund may not be generous or adequate, but a majority of today's retirees in Singapore do get at least something, which sets it apart from most of the other survey countries. Retirement ages are early. They're too early, but they're actually higher than in many of the other countries. And the longer retirement is deferred, the fewer years of retirement you have to finance, the less risk there is of running out of your savings. So that's a second factor. A third is the relatively high rates of receipt of asset income, even among current retirees. Singapore, the highest on insurance, one of the highest on stocks and bonds. So, to sum up, among the survey countries at least, a unique combination, not unique on any one of the dimensions, but putting them together, strong family support, relatively high labor force participation, high rates of pension receipt, and high rates of asset income receipt. I look forward to hearing the insights and reactions of those of you who have experience on the ground here that I don't have. But that's my attempt to interpret the somewhat surprisingly high relative living standard of elders in Singapore. Tomorrow's retirees, looking ahead to the future, they will obviously be more affluent. The median income of younger adults in the survey, and again, I might not have mentioned this, but the survey data was weighted by age, gender, and educational attainment. The income of the young is higher than the income of the old. They're more affluent. They're much more educated. And being more educated, I think, is relevant to sort of retirement prospects in two fundamental respects. One is that, as I hinted at earlier, younger workers will have the skills to remain productive when they become older workers. In rapidly developing economies, it often makes sense for employers to clear out the deadwood to make room for younger and more skilled rising generations. But as today's rising generations become tomorrow's elderly, that model of cashiering the old to make room for the young won't make economic sense anymore. And that will help extend work lives and make it easier to ensure adequate income in retirement. And the other is that as a general proposition, the more educated one is, the more likely one is to make long-term financial plans. And we didn't ask respondents directly whether they have long-term financial plans, but we did ask them whether they have ever sought professional financial advice. And here I show those results cross-tabbed by educational attainment. So you might consider that a sort of proxy for having a retirement plan in place. Today's retirees are already market-oriented, highly market-oriented relative to those in most of the other survey countries, but tomorrow's retirees will be even more market-oriented. I should note here that we are asking people about what sources do you expect to receive income from when you are retired? For some people, this is 10, 15, 20, 30, 35 years in the future. This data is expectational. It may even be aspirational. It doesn't mean that all young people own stocks and bonds or insurance policies. But this, when you ask people how they're thinking about their retirement, this is what they tell you their income is going to come from. Retirement ages will rise and rise significantly among younger workers. Here we're looking at the share of current retirees who retired after the age of 60 compared with the expectation for younger workers. For current workers, 36 versus 57%. Workers will not only, today's working generations will not only postpone retirement, but a remarkable share of them also intend to expect to receive labor income during retirement, which is why I put I thought I had put retirement in quotes here. Yes, I did, up at the top. When they're quote-unquote retired. The very notion of retirement and what that means seems to be shifting among younger generations. Perhaps retirement is now simply a gateway to a second career or perhaps an opportunity to start a business. So 76% of workers, non-retired respondents aged 20 to 59, expect when retired to have income from a job or a business they own. And a remarkable share expect not to retire at all, 37%. Now, there's sort of two ways to interpret this, and the survey can't really answer that. Is this a positive result or a negative result? 37% of Singaporeans now in the traditional working ages don't intend to ever retire. Well, I mean, that could be because they love their work and they want to be productively engaged into their 60s and 70s and perhaps even beyond. Or it could be that they can't afford, don't expect to be able to afford to retire. I think it's probably some one way and some the other. Expectations of support from the extended family. Multi-generational living. 63% of elderly today live with their grown children, live in an extended family. The expectation among workers aged 40 to 59, when they themselves are retired or elderly, 45%, and among workers 20 to 39, 34%. And I believe, I would have to check, but I believe that these figures exclude workers who do not have children. So we're looking at a sort of true measure of the expectation here. It's not distorted by the fact that a rising share of people simply don't have children to live with. Okay. And the income flows within families are also expected. They will still flow moderately from the young to the old, but will be declining in the future. Rates of pension receipt from the CPF will rise a bit. I think the big issue here is my distinguished associate and Mukulasher will, I think, have more to say about this. It's not so much that Singaporeans aren't saving enough, but that the return on savings isn't adequate. The replacement rate, I think, currently from the Central Provident Fund is about 25%. Most retirement planners would say that you need, well, roughly 70% typically in retirement. 50% is a lot of income to replace on your own through supplemental savings. And we did ask people about household savings and assets, and we found that the ratio of assets to income, roughly 2 to 1 at age 50, is not nearly sufficient to fill in that savings gap in the pension system and to maintain an adequate standard of living in retirement. So this is the last slide. Just a couple of strategic implications. Continue to raise retirement ages. The point I made before about the economic rationale for early retirement no longer making sense. And early retirement also greatly complicating and compounding the challenge of retirement planning itself. Perhaps save more, but most importantly, increase the return on savings. Asian family values. This constitutes, I think, a relative advantage. Over-reliance on the family in a demographically aging society can constitute a weakness. But if you have adequate government and market substitutes in place, then a strong family becomes a plus. So to preserve this, and then finally, and this is beyond the scope of the survey itself, but the paramount importance of raising the birth rate. If Singapore is to enjoy a prosperous future, there must at least be some Singaporeans left. And at a 1.3 fertility rate, your nation is looking to a future of hyper-aging, in which nearly 40% of the population will be age 60 and over, and of a steeply contracting workforce. Now, I might add that this is not the fault of women, the low birth rate, but the fault of perhaps a family culture, perhaps a workplace culture. But this needs to be an area for focus in the future in Singapore, as indeed throughout most of East Asia. I will stop there.
First of all, I just want to, again, thank you and thank Professor and Dean Kishore Mahbubani for inviting us here today and hosting this event. We are privileged to be up here with Professor Asher as well. I just might add that Prudential is sponsoring this research. There's one obvious reason, which is the very mission of our company. For 168 years, for 88 years in Asia, 81 years in Singapore, centers around providing long-term financial security for families, for individuals, both in terms of protecting their assets and in terms of accumulating their assets. And so this subject and finding solutions to these challenging demographic questions is just absolutely core to what we do, to why we exist. And so that's enough said about why we're interested in this. This is actually the second partnership project that we've participated in with Dr. Jackson and CSIS, the first being a project which produced an aging preparedness index back in 2010, looking at countries across the world and saying how prepared were they as nations for dealing with the retirement questions that they face. And we're very pleased to be working with Dr. Jackson. And this is, in addition to presenting this work and talking about it and sharing it with the public, with our associates, and with policymakers in Singapore, We're also visiting Malaysia and Hong Kong and Beijing this week. So it's a bit of a quick stop tour trying to release this very important research. Now I have 6 minutes, so I'm going to try to quickly go through this and hopefully get through in 6 minutes. Just a few thoughts. We often hear the phrase, the Asian century. Being in Asia, and being a Prudential in Asia, which we feel like we're the core of the Prudential group these days, we are constantly reminding ourselves about the amazing economic achievement and the amazing economic future of Asia. But I wonder whether this century might more appropriately be called the aging century. And how Asia deals with this question of aging, and as Dr. Jackson just appropriately called hyperaging, might determine whether this becomes the Asian century we hope for or not. So I pose whether that's really the question. And of course, we all know that Japan, if we look at demographic profiles, is sort of the archetypal example of the aging society. And these are what you often see, the diamond or the pyramid charts. Typically, we used to think of populations as pyramids, with the vast majority of the young people at the bottom, and it sloped up this way. And what you see for Japan between 1950, 2005, and 2050 is it completely inverts. It becomes an inverted pyramid, with the numbers at the bottom being smaller than the numbers, the bulge of the group that's aging. And we used to think this is a Japanese problem, but of course we know that China is looking at the same issue. You see the change from a pyramid to something that first looks like a pagoda, and then, I'm not sure what, not quite a reverse pyramid, but it's heading in that direction by 2050. Which country do you think this is? Anybody want to guess? Somebody guess Singapore? It's Myanmar. So you think of a country that's still at quite an early stage of economic development, now reforming, trying to catch up, if you will, in an economic sense. Even in Myanmar, by 2050, it's starting to have the same pattern. So what we're talking about here is not just a Singapore issue. It's not just a developed country issue. This is an issue that faces the entire Asian region. In fact, if you do the world chart, it faces the entire world. So this is truly a global question, a global issue, and one which our company and the people that we work with in the public sector obviously have to cooperate, because this is an issue that the private sector, public sector, individuals, civil society all have to be focused on to solve. This is a map that some of my Prudential colleagues have seen at various points. This is sort of what we do and where we are throughout the region, which is now 12 markets for insurance, 10 for asset management. Recently announced we'll be entering Cambodia, so that number is growing. So we're going to be part of the solution to this issue throughout the region. And I don't mean to read this slide, but this from our standpoint, and I think in solving this question, today we're talking about retirement and retirement savings. We're not going to be focusing on the other point, but we can't lose sight of the fact that in order to get to retirement with assets intact, you first need to protect assets on the way. So that means against a premature death, or against a medical crisis, or against a long-term illness. So there's a significant protection issue, and what this talks about is our effort across the board in the region with 350,000 salespeople and a wide range of products to try to deal with protection and accumulation. And I think what we do here in Singapore is a terrific example of trying to bring that whole array of expert advice and excellent product range to do that. I just will summarize, as Dr. Jackson did, with 3 policy points, and not to take anything away with his 4, but I want to add some others. This is complicated enough, we probably need more than 3 or 4. One is, I think, across the region and globally, because of the gap that exists still in retirement savings and in terms of protection, every country needs to continuously look at the long-term incentives that exist for individuals and families. How do the incentives stack up for how the money that the family has is spent or saved? And within savings, how it is saved. And constantly, I think we need to re-examine, are we encouraging enough to go into long-term savings? And that isn't just a question about, should the family take another trip or buy a luxury product or what. It's not. It's partly related to consumption, but also within the field of savings, encouraging longer-term savings and savings which is going to be held in place and not spent. I think the tax system may not quite be addressing that uniformly across the region. There are places where annuity products, for example, are taxed in a way that's either confusing or discourages using those products, which would be good products to force people to save for a much longer period of time. Perhaps there are markets, I can say this is currently an issue in the United States, where the tax system is encouraging an overinvestment in housing. And housing is a very illiquid asset when you get to 65 and most of your asset is in house. It's hard to convert that in most societies into cash for your retirement years. So perhaps the tax incentives related to housing need to be addressed as well. Again, I'm not focusing on Singapore. I'm really talking regionally. The second area, which I think we don't talk about enough, is the relationship of the development of the long-term capital markets, the stock markets, the bond markets, particularly the long-term corporate bond market, to being able to offer solutions. Financial institutions like Prudential have to match assets and liabilities. It's part of our risk management. We are subject to solvency regulations. We can't make long-term promises and then have to be able to invest the money only in short-term assets. So continued cooperation with governments and encouraging governments around the region to further develop the long-term corporate and government bond markets will allow us to make more innovative products to deal with these challenges, where we can then invest long-term and pass on those kinds of returns with the confidence that our balance sheet is good because we've matched with long-term assets. And finally, and this can't be overstated, is the importance of improving financial literacy. The data on aspirations that Dr. Jackson shared and the data on actual situation of retirees today, our job is to try to help people understand their aspirations, to convert that into a plan of action and to help them update and keep those plans current. That depends a lot on improving and increasing the level of awareness and the level of financial literacy everywhere, including, even though Singapore is probably as aware and conscious of financial needs and financial planning, I think you saw 70% of the post-secondary educated people say they are at least consulting in a financial advisor. That's a very encouraging statistic, but it's not high enough, and probably there's a difference between having a plan and updating a plan and living a plan. So we can't stop with that. And working with the media, working with academic institutions, cooperating with the public sector to keep talking about this issue and to try to increase the level of financial awareness and planning is critical. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Khanat, Professor.
Thank you, Jeffrey. It's a privilege to be invited to participate in this function. Dr. Jackson has covered with great deal of lucidity a very complex area and a policy problem that is going to face East Asian countries for a long time to come. Donald just mentioned about some of the countries. If we look at India, China, and the United States, in the 1950s, their demographic profiles were very different. By 2050, the single largest population cohort in each of the three countries will be women 70 years plus, and second will be men 70 years plus. So we are talking really about the gray tsunami, with which we have not yet, as policymakers and as people, quite come to the grips of it. Let me first take up Dr. Jackson's one of the recommendations. I agree with his recommendations, but my remarks are going to be about complementing and elaborating on some parts of it. One of the recommendations was about increasing the rates of return on investment. This is an important issue, and there are many countries where pension assets and long-term savings assets, both by individuals and by the institutions which have been entrusted with those savings, there are large unexplored opportunities whereby they could improve their performance and get larger returns. However, at the margin, once some of these low-hanging fruit is already picked, at the margin, we now know that it is getting much harder to get larger rates of return, and particularly the rates of return that that are meaningful to the members, which is the returns that are actually credited to the members' accounts. So what that tends to suggest is that there needs to be a lot more of a partnership between the different sectors rather than simply talking about individual or family responsibility, the state responsibility, and so on. Try to get together a set of partnership which will also permit the innovations in cost of delivering financial services. We have a lot of technological changes that are occurring, and how do we use those technological changes to try to reduce the delivery of financial services. So one of the, in many countries, particularly where market has been small, one of the constraints in individuals going to get the financial advice is the cost of doing so in relation to their total pension assets or their pensions, their savings. So this is one area that I would suggest requires some consideration. In many parts of Asia, increasing the rate of return is not going to be as easy because many of the large pools of pension and provident funds are related very much to the political economy of the country. And the political economy of the country doesn't change that easily to permit the members to benefit from higher returns. Let me now come to what is the state's role when we are talking about retirement financing. There is a total amount of resources, financial as well as others, that are going to be needed. A larger issue which has not been as much addressed because of institutional and other factors is that problem of aging is that people are living longer. But we also know that the health-related expenditure and aging are very correlated. So people who are 75 and above, in Japan, for example, as average person consumes 4.5 times more than a person 65 and below. Now, when you get such a sharp increase in per person health expenditure, then talking about the aging and the financing of aging, it makes sense to try to see if there are any possibilities of coordination between the healthcare and the pension policies, which will try to reduce the combined share of those expenditure on the society. We already know that in many of the OECD countries, the combined health and pension expenditure are very high. In the United States, for example, pension expenditure appear manageable with some reforms. But once you take pension plus health, that becomes a much more of a tricky issue. So time may have come in terms of our thinking to try to see how we can make a combined impact on the total expenditure. Now, when Dr. Jackson rightly pointed out that just relying on family, particularly when demography is changing, is not going to be an advantage or is not going to be at least a total solution. There are going to be other solutions. So what is the role that the state can play? In every country, East Asian as well as others, there are certain type of risks that individuals face in retirement, which only the state is able to help mitigate. It doesn't mean it needs to take the full responsibility, but it needs to take a major responsibility in organizing it. One is the managing the longevity risk. Now, when the longevity risk, because the longevity is so uncertain, we have seen that the fertility rates have been repeatedly, the models have not performed well. We have not invested enough in the demographic modeling, in the fertility and longevity trends modeling, and how that may impact on the society. So the state has an important role in trying to improve the modeling part of the longevity trends and fertility. The longevity and inflation risks that the individuals face, individuals are not able to bear it well. It has to be some sort of a social risk pooling that needs to be arranged, and that area requires a lot more attention in the East Asian countries than has been the case. Just as the family as a unit is no longer homogeneous, what we have now is not just look at the averages the way the survey is providing, but what I would be very much more interested is the variance around and what are those that are, what is the tail risk that in the financial jargon that's being talked about, but what are the variances where there are many people who are going to fall out, and what type of policies that are going to be needed, what innovations are going to be needed to address the retirement risk for them. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Asher. So many issues, so little time. I will therefore immediately throw the floor open to the audience. I invite you to please identify yourself, go up to the microphone, and to address your question or your observation to either the main speaker or to the two panelists.
Kanwaljit Soin, I'm president of WINGS, Women's Initiative for Aging Successfully. Could I make 3 points, please? First one is that most of those people who had retired or were the main earners that were respondents were probably all males, because the older women have not been in the formal labor force. So a lot of the perceptions that have been talked about relate to men and not so much to women. That's one point. The second point is there is a many women in Singapore, in fact 60 to 70% of women over the age of 70 are widows. So the man, the husband, may or may not make retirement plans for them. And from the statistics that we know in Singapore, most elderly women depend on financial flows from children, which are getting more and more difficult. So I don't think retirement for them would be as rosy as has been alluded to in this. The other thing I think which Professor Usher alluded to is that we talked to them about retirement policies, and many of them said retirement responsibility, and many of them said it was individual. But when it came to long-term care, they expected government to step in. Mm-hmm. So what about health care? Because 55% of health care financing comes from out-of-pocket expenses. And I don't know whether this was factored in their perceptions of retirement. And another point that I want to make, it's a little bit, this is more interesting point, that Singapore is so Asian values, and yet when it comes to having a family, the total fertility rate seems to go down. There seems to be a disconnect between Asian values and then leading a single life. Thank you.
Yes, there is a sad disconnect. You're absolutely right that the survey is disproportionately male because main earners are disproportionately male. But there are some women in the survey. And you are also right that in terms of income, elderly women, particularly if they are living alone, have lower incomes and significantly lower incomes. However, and surprisingly so, the level of support for individual responsibility on some of these normative attitudinal questions, we did not see the expected gender difference. From experience, we did the same survey in the UK to have a point of comparison with the Western country. And in the UK, women answered that, the way stereotypically you would expect them to, right? More risk averse, less willing, less prone to support individual responsibility, more prone to support government responsibility. But we didn't see that in East Asia. We saw that in South Korea, I think, but not in the other countries and not in Singapore, which was surprising to us. Anyway, thank you for your very thoughtful comments.
No. Would you like to add? The next.
Edward on. I think related to what Kawanjit said, if women are living longer, right? Average of 3 or more years longer than men. When the husbands die, actually the women should, under normal circumstances, have more income now, because the husband would have left some money for her. And instead of supporting 2 persons now, that income, that whatever income left would be able to support her alone. So the widows should be better off, I think. The question I want to put to the panel is, do you know of countries where fertility rates have been encouragingly more positive today? And what are the kind of measures that have contributed to them?
We now know that it is easier to bring the fertility rate down than to bring it back up. And wherever the governments have tried to bring them up, the increase has been somewhere between 0.3 and 0.4 percentage points. So if you are at 1.3, 1.4, you can go to about 1.8. Okay, so that's about the kind of range in which we are talking about the increases. For each percentage point increase, however, in many countries, the cost and the commitment of the society has been very large. And that commitment of the society through the government in terms of paternity leaves, in terms of the way the careers is not disrupted of women, in the way child support facilities and so on are done. It is that willingness to do so that's going to make that particular difference. And each society then has to decide whether that would be worthwhile for them. But declining fertility rate has been almost a global trend.
Yeah, the potential for policy to raise birth rates is certainly limited. I mean, you can't bribe women to have children. It doesn't work. You have to create an environment in which they want to have children. And in today's world, that means creating an environment, an economic and social and family environment in which they can both have children and have a job. And I think one of the most interesting facts in high-income countries today, I'll bet you everybody or most people in the audience think that the more working women you have, the fewer children you have. But in fact, in high-income countries today, the fertility rate is positively correlated, and strongly so, with female labor force participation. So the more working women, the more children. And the reason is because society, the aspirations of women have changed everywhere, right? They're more educated. Aspirations have changed. But some societies are better at enabling them to have a dual role than others. And there are two basic models. There's the French or Scandinavian model, which involves comprehensive pronatal policies, right? This is job guarantee, paid maternity leave, job guarantees, daycare free at the point of purchase, etc. It can make a difference at the margin. I think you're absolutely right, Professor, 0.2 to 0.4. But 0.2 to 0.4, going from 1.3 to 1.8 is the difference between demographic implosion and a fertility gap that you can close with some modest net immigration. So that is certainly an important difference. The other model, though, and that the French or Scandinavian model is very expensive. The other model is flexible labor markets. If women can exit and re-enter the labor market easily, retrain, start another career, that's more the UK, the US model, and both can work. But both entail a change in family culture and in workplace culture. Bribing women through tax incentives or baby bonuses doesn't work. Can't bribe women.
Raymond Kwok from VC.com. I must declare my interest. I was from Prudential, London, and I came back to Singapore in 1982. At that time, I wrote a paper to the government on asset-rich, cash-poor situation that we're going to face now. And the paper actually is on reverse mortgage, because I understand that has been discussed in UK and other parts of the world. And it taken the government a long time, and I think about 10 years ago, it was taken up. But even in Singapore, the situation doesn't argue well. And these situations of personal building and asset base, especially in Asia, our value is basically, we like to acquire a house, we like to accumulate assets. And can the panel share with us how this phenomenon is panning out around the world? In Asia, how do we manage this situation to to allow people like us, growing older and wiser, to have a nice future. Thank you.
I'll say something about that. I don't have a canned solution to that, but I do think it's a really important issue. Before I do that, I just want to comment on the previous point, just very briefly. The question about widows are better off if their husbands are gone. As a married person about to turn 60, I just would rather not spread that around very much. But no, it really is a serious point that was raised earlier, and I just think it speaks to what we do and the importance of emphasizing and raising the awareness that, you mentioned a statistic, that the largest cohort of population in many countries is going to be women over 70 looking into the future. And as we are dealing with financial literacy and we're dealing with financial planning, it's very important that those plans for each family, while there's still 2 living spouse members, that those plans address that issue. So we have to keep working on that and talking about that. And it's not just a matter of products especially, but really the planning process itself. Coming back to the point about lots of illiquid wealth stored up in the housing stock, this is, I think, one of the most important areas that has to be solved between public and private sector over the next decade. And for 2 reasons. One is you've got a question of intergenerational transfer that's going to happen as all of this aging and lots of people are passing on. There's a lot of housing stock that's going to change hands. So there's opportunity, I think, to create financing. The private sector can offer some solutions, but there's a question of consumer fairness that has to be dealt with and a question of risk management. But I do think there's a lot of opportunity going forward if public and private sector work together to create programs that tied together with public retirement programs potentially that could unlock a lot of cash from the housing market.
Reverse mortgage market is always very difficult to organize because of the uncertainties, the pricing issues, who bears the risks, and so on. So the government will have to be an important part of the player taking up some of the risk. And if the government agency is not willing to do that, the reverse mortgage market will have very limited reach. This is the reason why NTUC, for example, stopped giving reverse mortgages some time ago. I think they didn't sell more than 250 or something. It is important to get the housing wealth rechanneled. Now, in larger countries, there are different ways to do that. Between urban and semi-urban areas, cost of living is very different. So you could sell your urban house and move in retirement towards your village or some other places, and you can realize that marginal difference. In an urban city-state like Singapore, that is not so easy to do, and that's where the challenges arise. But if we look at the United States or if we look at larger countries, people have always done that and part finance their retirement. Even when they have Social Security, they have supplemented that by selling their larger house and moving into a smaller place in a place which is not so expensive. Okay, so I think some of the natural market forces should be allowed to operate. There was a very important article by a Harvard professor who talked about the market economy and market society. And I think as we try to move the housing or try to realize financial value of housing, we need to remember that distinction, that market economy is desirable, but we are on our way to becoming a market society, which is not so desirable. So we need to have some caution about this.
Hello, I'm Frederick Bromford from EDEC Risk Institute. Before asking my question, I work for a French business school, so I was going to add one point about the French model, just for the record. In France, the more children you have, the less income tax you pay. Basically, beyond 4 kids, it doesn't matter how much you make, you don't pay any income tax, which makes it's clear direct subsidization of fertility. Okay. My question is about the difference between corporate pension plans and sort of DIY Pillar 3 type.
Could I ask you to speak up?
Sorry, I was wondering if in your survey results, I didn't hear any difference between people's perception of what they would receive from their corporate pension plans and what might be their self-saving, own savings decisions. And obviously this can make a lot of difference. So I was wondering if there was anything in the study that had looked at that, and if people were mostly expecting to receive retirement through their own savings.
In Singapore in particular?
In Asia.
In Asia. Well, the expected rate of, except in Taiwan, which has the second-tier labor pension, which is an employer-based pension. The rates of sort of employer or corporate pension receipt for current retirees are rather low, but they do rise. The expectational data shows them increasing quite substantially. I don't recall the data for Singapore offhand. I'd be happy to share that with you. I know there was a striking increase in China receipt rates in the new enterprise annuity system. A much larger share of workers indicating that they expected income from enterprise annuities than I would have anticipated given my understanding of what was happening on the ground in China. Not much movement in South Korea, as far as if I recall the data correctly. They're trying to launch a corporate system to transform their unfunded severance pay into an externally funded pension system, but I don't think we saw much movement there. Anyway, we did ask that. We had a question which asked about, in detail, about sources of income in retirement today or expected sources of income in retirement in the future. However, we're not able to show the contribution of each source to income. We asked, do you expect to receive most, some, or none of your income from each of the following sources? And then we ask overall about household income and overall about net financial assets. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm afraid we have come to the end of the lunch session. Thank you very much for coming here and for participating. I would like to ask you before you go to join me in thanking the speaker and the 2 panelists for their contributions today.